Hello everyone, this is Blake, and today I'll be giving an introduction to topicality and theory. Topicality you'll sometimes hear abbreviated to T. So topicality and theory are two different types of arguments in LD debate, but they're very similar in their structure, and they are both alike in the fact that they're very different from other forms in structure of arguments that you see. So there's a reason that they're grouped together. It would be hard to talk about one without talking about the other, but remember that they're two very distinct things, and we'll highlight some of those distinctions in a bit. But to start, we're going to focus on topicality, or T. We're just going to go through a full explanation of the structure and the purpose of T and all those things, and then we'll talk about theory in a bit later on in the video. So what is topicality? Topicality is a structured way to argue that your opponent is not debating about the right subject area. So a lot of times in debate, we sometimes might hear the affirmative debater read a case that we don't think is necessarily applicable to the topic. We don't think that they are accurately talking about the resolution in the way that they should be. And topicality is a way for us to make that argument that can actually that is actually structured in a way that the judge can evaluate and maybe give us a win for pointing out that there is that flaw in the opponent's case. So topicality is specific to each resolution. It is based on the topic, obviously, because it's topicality. So every 2 months when the topic changes, we're going to be dealing with new topicality shells. And they are only read by the neg because the affirmative debater has the burden to be topical. The negative debater has the burden of proving that the affirmative debater is wrong. So of course the neg is not going to be defending the topic. So the affirmative cannot claim that the negative is not topical because that's not their burden. So the negative debater is going to be the one that is reading topicality as an off-case position. So there are 4 parts of a T-shell, kind of 5, but whenever people are reading them around, they'll split them into 4 main sections. So first is the interpretation. In topicality, the interpretation is a definition of the term that we are alleging that the affirmative debater misinterpreted. Again, topicality is saying that they're not upholding the resolution, so if they're not upholding the resolution, that means that they're ignoring what some of the words in the resolution means. The interpretation is where we pick that word and define it. The next part is the violation. It really quickly explains how the AF did not meet that definition that we just provided in the interpretation. The next part is the standards. The standards explain why the definition is good for debate and gives a bit of a justification about why the affirmative debater should have used that interpretation that we provided. And then the last part is voters, and voters basically explains what this whole argument means in terms of the round and how the judge should understand it. And within the heading of voters, we have a group of arguments that are called paradigm issues that we're going to talk about in detail at the end. So paradigm issues are a little bit complicated. They include a lot of vocabulary, so they're going to be one of the very last things that we talk about in this video. But the 4 big parts of a T-shell are interpretation, violation, standards, and voters. So getting into detail, we'll start with the interpretation. So for topicality, the interpretation is a definition and a citation. The citation is normally pretty easy because we're just dealing with a dictionary. So you might say Merriam-Webster defines blank as whatever, and that's all you really need to put for the interpretation. Again, the word needs to be directly in the resolution. For instance, if the resolution says firearms, you're not going to want to use the term gun in your definition. You're going to want to use whatever term was exactly in the resolution. And then this last bullet point says that the interpretation can be based on terms of art. A term of art is a term or is a word or group of words that in a specific context take on a special meaning. So for instance, if we're talking about nuclear power, defining power and defining nuclear separately might give you a little bit of a different understanding of what we really mean when we say nuclear power. So if there's a term that really needs to be together to make sense, then it's totally fine to use that term together and define it that way. But if you're defining a term of art, you might not find it in a dictionary, in which case you'll have to do some research and find a definition used in some journal or that's provided by some expert in whatever field you're focused on. So the violation is the next part of the T-shell. Basically, the violation is just an explanation of how the AF did not meet the definition that you just provided. The violation is a pretty easy part of the shell. We don't really need to spend too much time talking about it, and we won't typically spend that much time reading it in the actual shell proper. So it's just really quickly saying the AF didn't do whatever. We want to be specific as possible, however. Sometimes you'll hear people just get up and say, violation, the AF doesn't meet this definition. But that's too generic. That doesn't really tell the judge exactly what you're thinking. So even if it may seem obvious to you, take the time to make that violation a bit specific. Say exactly what the AF did, maybe instead, like how they might have misinterpreted the word or something along those lines. Next is standards. Standards is where the bulk of the shell is. This is where a lot of the argumentation is happening on T-shells. So basically the way that standards are set up is that you're going to name an area of focus and then explain it and the impact of the definition that you provided and debating with that definition or breaking that definition and the impact it has on that area of focus. That sounds a little bit strange, but in a second I'm going to give you some examples and we'll kind of get a better idea of what that means. And then an important thing to do strategically when you're giving your standards is to implicate voters. In a little bit we're going to talk about voters more in detail, but if you remember from the quick outline I gave, voters basically explain what this whole argument means for the judge. So just like when we're writing normal cases, like our AF case or a disad or something along those lines, we want it to have a clear connecting line of logic between all parts of the argument. We want to have a clear connecting line through the standards that lead us directly to the voters. So let's look at some of these examples of what standards are. So if you remember, I said standards are like areas of focus that you name and then explain. So these are some of the names that you'll hear a lot. By no means is this an exhaustive list. If you Google debate standards, LD debate standards, or policy debate standards, or anything along those lines, you'll find plenty of blogs and posts online that give other examples. So we're just going to run through these as some examples to hopefully give us a better idea of what a normal standard might look like.
So the first example we have here is limits. Limits is basically a term that describes the ability to draw lines between which kind of arguments are acceptable or not. In other words, it is the limits placed on what is a topical or not topical affirmative. So for instance, you might say that the definition that the affirmative is operating under does not provide sufficient limits for the affirmative debater. This means that there could be any number of AFs that are considered quote-unquote topical according to the definition that the AF is using, but really we should use the definition that I provided in my interpretation because it is a much more fair way of limiting the number of AFs that can happen so the negative debater has a chance of preparing for them. The next example that I have here is context. So because topicality is focused on definitions of the words in terms involved in the resolution, if the resolution lends certain context to terms that might make them mean something different than what the AF was interpreting, then it's important to point that out. So a good example of this is like what we were talking about before when we were saying that certain terms are terms of art and that we can't define the word in a vacuum. So for instance, if there was a topic about nuclear power, and your opponent was just talking about nuclear weapons, you could say that within the context of the term nuclear power, nuclear takes on the meaning of using fission and fusion to create energy as opposed to using fusion and fission to create destructive weapons. So basically, context is saying, in the light of what the rest of the topic is about, or the terms around the word in question, the AF is misdefining the word. The next standard that I have listed here is clash. So clash is a term used a lot in debate because it refers to the ability to have a good debate, good direct interaction between two ideas. So if we're making an argument about clash in a T-shell, we're saying that the affirmative case is something that is so out of left field that there's no way that we can have an effective debate because there's no way to directly interact with them, because the negative never had a chance to prepare, because the affirmative is not talking about the topic and the negative was prepared to talk about the topic. The next example that we have here is common usage. This is basically saying that whatever definition is used in the T-shell interpretation is a better definition because it is used more commonly. If you're saying common usage, you're going to want to throw something out there like multiple dictionaries to back up your definition. So for instance, you might say this definition is shared by Merriam-Webster, Oxford Dictionary, Dictionary.com, and a couple of other places. So these are the most common places where we get definitions. So it's obvious that this is the definition that we should be using for this term, as opposed to some off-the-wall random one. Another example that you'll hear a lot is a standard of ground. Ground is basically the breadth of different types of arguments and argumentative areas of focus that you have available to you as a debater. If you have limited ground, that means that there's no way that you can really have a chance in the round. So whenever you're talking about ground as a standard in topicality, you're going to say, because the affirmative debater is not talking about the topic, the negative debater has no ground to stand on. They have nothing available to them that they can use to refute the affirmative debater, which means that the debate is inherently unfair from the beginning for the negative debater. And the last one here is framer's intent. I threw this out here because it's a term that you might hear a lot. It's not necessarily a super strong standard because it is based on intent, which is something that is hard to prove. But basically, the argument of framer's intent is that whenever the people that were on the topic committee for the circuit we're debating on picked this resolution, they picked it because they clearly wanted us to talk about this definition that I'm providing, not this other random off-the-wall one. So this is basically saying that the debate during this 2-month topic period was designed to be focused on this definition. It was the intention of the people in the topic committee that this was the discussion we'd have, not the one that the AF is having. So again, those are just a few examples. They're not exhaustive. Do your own research into some other opportunities, and if you have an argument that you want to make for a T-shell standard and you can't think of what category it would fall under, don't let that keep you from making the argument. Good arguments, even if they don't have names, should always be made in debate. So the fourth and final section of a T-shell is voters, and in voters you name and explain how the debate was hurt by the AF. So what I mean by naming certain things is you are going to say there are certain things that are intrinsic to debate that are good that were injured by the AF, and those things are 90% of the time in LD fairness and education. So you're going to say fairness is intrinsic to debate. And here are some justifications why fairness is so important. And also, education is intrinsic to debate, and here's a couple of reasons why education is so important. And if you followed the advice that I gave you for standards and you implicated your voters in the standards, you wrote when you were talking about clash or when you were talking about ground, you said, this means that the debate is unfair, this means that I can't learn, blah, blah, blah. So that means that when your judge hears fairness and education are really important, they realize, oh, okay, so if the debate is unfair and uneducational, that's really bad. So that's why we call these voters, is because they help the judge figure out why they're voting the way they do. So the voter section basically justifies why these things are important in the context of the debate round. The things that we're talking about, clash, common usage, context, things of that nature. So next, we're going to talk briefly about theory and the difference between theory and T. So what is theory as opposed to T? So theory is a structured way to argue that your opponent is breaking the rules of debate. So whereas topicality was focused on the resolution and the wording of the resolution, theory is more about the abstract nature of debate, the rules that are in place, and the norms that exist within debate. So these are not specific to a resolution. Once you write a theory shell, you can hypothetically read it on any topic. But the important thing here is that you are following this structure, so that way you are not just kind of complaining about how unfair something is, but rather following a structure to give the judge a way to vote off of this. Now, because both debaters, the affirmative and the negative, can break rules, then either the affirmative or negative can call out their opponent for breaking rules. So whereas topicality is read only by the neg, theory can be read by the aff or the neg, depending on what goes down in the round. So the key distinction between T and theory is that topicality is worried about did you follow the words in the resolution, and theory is worried about did you break the rules of debate and the norms of debate. So the general structure of theory is the same as in T. The first part is the interpretation, then violation, then standards, then voters. So the violation and voters are the same for both T and theory. In practice, you're just, of course, when you're talking about violation, you're going to talk about whatever the interp you wrote is, as opposed to just some random definition. But there are a couple of differences in writing the interpretations and standards that I'll talk about here. So for interpretations, we're not relying on a definition anymore. So with topicality, it's absolutely imperative that you have a definition because we're talking about words that came from the resolution. When we're talking about rules of debate, those are more things that are going to come from instruction manuals, or you can just say something that is a norm in debate or should be a norm in debate. So it's simply a claim of what that rule is. And you should be as specific as possible. So a good example of this is there's a very common form of theory called condo theory, which is an abbreviation for conditionality theory. So sometimes negative debaters will read a bunch of off-case positions and claim that they can drop any of those positions at any time if they want. And that ability to drop arguments whenever you want without discretion is called conditionality. A lot of times affirmative debaters will say it's not fair for the negative to be able to do that if they're reading like 4 or 5 off-case positions and they can just drop them at any time. So the interpretation in that instance would be that the negative debater may not read more than 3 conditional off-case positions. I didn't get that from any rule manual. I didn't get that from a professor or a journal or anything like that. It's just a rule that and a norm that I think should be true of debate, and I put it in plain and clear language, and that's a perfectly viable interpretation for theory. You don't need to have any form of evidence to back you up. So next is the difference with standards. So there are some standards that we can't use when we're talking about theory that we could use in topicality, and these make sense if you think about it. So common usage, context, and framer's intent are all based on definition. Common usage because it is the definition used in a lot of dictionaries. Context because it is what the word means in relation to other things, and framer's intent is because it's what the framers wanted this word to mean. But we're no longer talking about the meaning of words with theory, so we shouldn't be making those standard arguments. However, we do gain a couple of new standards that we can use for theory that we wouldn't necessarily want to use for T. So again, these are just a few of the examples. You can find more online, or you don't even need to find them anywhere else. If you just come up with some, feel free to use them. So some of these standards that we use for theory that we wouldn't want to use for T are real-world education. Basically, this argument is saying that the norm for debate or the rule for debate that the interpretation lays out helps us prepare better for what life and debate interactions are like in the real world. So it's better for us to follow those norms because we can learn more, because we're following rules that are true of interactions in normal everyday life. Time skew is a standard that says because they're breaking this rule, there's no way that I can win this round because of the time limits laid out in LD debate. If you have debated in LD before, you know that the 1AR is an incredibly difficult speech because you only have 4 minutes to respond to 7 minutes of arguments made by your opponent. So a lot of times the affirmative will make a claim of time skew because they have such a limited time to go over so much material that the negative debater really should not be breaking rules and making them have to deal with that as well. So that's kind of what time skew is saying, whereas strat skew is less focused on the actual time limits related to debate, but rather saying that because there's so many strategic barriers that they've set up, it's unfair and it's completely impossible for the debater that's reading theory to win. So an example of this would be if the negative debater got up and read 30 off-case positions that were all really brief and blippy and all conditional, then the affirmative could get up and say, there's no way that I can physically get to 30 negative flows and still extend my case and sufficiently refute all of them. That's just too many strategic burdens that they're putting on me. So there's not so much a mention of the time there when we're talking about strat skew, but it is a mention of trying to push the debater past what they have the ability to do within the confines of broader rules of debate. Okay, so now at this point we're going to switch over to talking about paradigm issues. So if you'll remember when we were going over the outline of structure, I said that there are 4 big parts of it, but there is a 5th thing that we need to consider that is typically lumped in with voters. So the 4 big parts are interpretation, violation, standards, and voters. And then within the voters section of shells, we're also going to get something called paradigm issues. So what exactly are paradigm issues? Paradigm issues are subjects of a meta-debate, that is, debating about debate. And those debates govern how the judge interprets the T or theory shell in the debate that is happening on that shell. So that's a little bit of a weird concept, so let's try to kind of break that down. So the thing about T and theory is that they are both very distinct from other forms of debate. We're not reading a lot of evidence. We're acknowledging the fact that we're in a debate round and there are rules related to debate round. We're not pretending that we're passing policies or anything like that. So because this is so different from other things in debate, there's less of an assumption about how these things should be understood and evaluated and how these cases should resolve. So the role of clarifying those rules is on the person who read T or theory. They need to tell the judge, here's how we understand and evaluate T and theory because it is so different from other forms of debate. So there are 3 typical paradigm issue questions that come up, and they answer 3 fundamental questions. So the questions that paradigm issues need to answer are, how should your opponent structure a response? So how, if somebody reads T or theory against me, how am I supposed to get up and respond to them? How do I operate within the structure of interpretation, violation, standards, and voters when I'm making my response? The next question is, what happens if the person who read the shell wins that the shell is true? Okay, so you proved that your opponent is unfair or not providing an educational space, but what does that mean? And then the last question is it possible for your opponent to win if they prove that you are wrong, that they are being fair, or that they are being educational? If your opponent proves that, do they win the round? So we're going to talk about what these debates look like and what terms are associated with them. So the first paradigm issue is competing interps versus reasonability. Those are the debate terms that are related to the answering of the question how your opponent should structure a response. So for competing interps, the argument is that if your opponent wants to answer the T or theory shell, they need to get up and give a different interpretation. That's where the term competing interps comes from, which means that they need to provide another definition of the same word or another rule for debate and prove why that rule or definition is better than the one that you provided. Whereas reasonability is claiming that if your opponent can prove that they were being reasonably fair or reasonably educational, then that means that there's no reason to do anything about the T or theory shell. So basically the distinction here is that if competing interps is true, your opponent can only prove the theory shell or T shell wrong by providing a better alternative interpretation and standards to justify it, or if reasonability is true, they just need to prove that they are reasonably not abusive, and that's sufficient for the judge to ignore the debate that's happening on the T and theory shell. So because this lecture is an introduction to these concepts, I'm not going to go into extensive detail about how we go about making competing interps claims or making reasonability claims. But we do have a video that is about answering T and theory, so I checked that video out if you're wanting a clearer picture of what it means to give a competing interp or make reasonability claims. So the next paradigm issue is drop the debater versus drop the argument. This is the debate that relates to the question of what happens if we prove that the shell is true, that your opponent is being abusive, that they are unfair, that they are not educational. What does that mean? So the claim that Drop the Debater is making is that your opponent loses the round if they are being unfair or uneducational, because they have damaged the round in a way that makes it so that there's no more benefit to having this debate, so they deserve to lose the round because they did that. Drop the Argument, however, is claiming that sure, you prove that your opponent is being unfair or uneducational with certain arguments they are making, but the judge should still be able to look at other arguments that were fair and were educational and evaluate the round based on that. So if Drop the Debater is true, then your opponent loses if you prove that your shell is true and that they are being abusive. If Drop the Argument is true, your opponent can still win even if they are proven to be unfair and uneducational in certain parts of the debate. The last paradigm issue that you'll see is no RVIs versus RVIs. So RVI is an abbreviation for reverse voting issue, which basically, if you think about it, is just a term that is saying if T or theory is a voting issue, if the judge can vote based off of it, can they vote the other way that we would typically expect? So if T in theory is saying that the person who is abusive should win the round, that's a typical voting issue, then can we reverse that and say that if the person can prove that they were not abusive, that they win the round? And this answers the question of, is it possible for your opponent to win if they disprove the shell? So if we say that there is no RVI, there's no way that we can reverse that voting issue. You're saying that your opponent doesn't win just by proving the shell is untrue. They need to win other arguments, other places on the floor in order to win the round. But if we do get RVIs, if RVIs are true, then that means that the way that we would typically vote on the shell can be reversed, and if your opponent wins the shell and proves that they are not abusive, they win the round. So RVIs can be confusing for a lot of people. Basically, the way to think about it is that if one debater reads a shell, voting for them would be a normal way to vote. But if we reverse that, then the person who got the shell read against them has the potential to win based on that shell. However, the important distinction here is that if we win that RVIs are true, if you prove that your opponent can win based on the shell, they still need to prove that the shell is false. There's an if here that's really important. Your opponent doesn't just win the round by proving that RVIs are possible. They need to prove that RVIs are possible and they deserve it because the shell was read against them wrongfully. So because we've covered a lot in this video, I put an extra slide in here to go over just what a structure of a shell looks like when we put all this stuff together. So this is all one example. It just continues on up here. So if we start at the beginning, the first part is the interpretation. If it is a topicality shell, that's a definition. If it's a theory shell, it's just a rule. And then next is the violation. It just says what the opponent did that was wrong. Next is the standards. So we might list a couple of standards. We could list 2, we could list 3, or you could also just list 1. That's totally fine. You can put as many standards as you think is necessary to make your point. But you're going to name your standard and then give an explanation. You're going to say clash and then say, because of the behavior of my opponent, I cannot adequately interact with the arguments, blah, 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 and make your case there. So once we've listed and explained all of our standards, we're going to move on to voters. We're going to say the first voter is education, or whatever we want it to be. We're going to give a couple of justifications for why that voter is important. So in this case, we'd say the first voter is education. One, education is the only thing we take away from debate. It's the whole purpose of this activity. Second, education is why we get school funding. The only reason we have debate programs is because schools give us money because they believe it is an educational program. And then we move on to other voters. We say the next voter is fairness. Fairness is important because, one, it is key to recruiting in debate. If everybody knows that debate is unfair, nobody's going to want to play along. And then we can give another justification, or we can stop there. Just like with the standards, you can list as many or as few justifications as you want, as long as you get your point across. So once you've justified your voters as much as you want, you move on to your paradigm issues. The paradigm issues that I've listed here are the stances that you take normally if you're the one reading the shell. If you think about it, these are all the positions that make it a lot harder for the person that the shell was read against. So it makes sense why these would be the stances that you want to take. But you basically say competing interps, and then give some justifications for why competing interps are better than reasonability. And then you say no RVIs, and then give some reasons why your opponent doesn't get RBIs, and then you would say drop the debater and give some reasons why drop the debater is better than drop the argument. You might also just hear people mention them both, say competing interps over reasonability or competing interps are better than reasonability. Same thing, no RBIs over RBIs, drop the debater over drop the argument. Basically, that's just another way of saying it. So you're just going to state what your stance is on those paradigm issues and then give some justifications for them. So just like with standards, if you look stuff up, you can see some examples of what justifications for different sides of paradigm issues look like. However, I would strongly suggest that you take the time to try to come up with some yourself and really think about these issues to give you a better understanding of what this debate actually looks like. So that's all I have for this video. Again, I know that this covers a lot of ground, so later on down the line we might get into some more specific videos to clarify things like that. Just let us know if that's something that you want to see, and thanks for watching.